Are you doing the counting, or am I to assume we're live?
I'm not doing the counting. We're live. So
Oh, okay.
You can go ahead. For the people watching the recording, we're having technical troubles with the live stream. That's why the first few seconds are going to be like this. But
It's okay. They get the chance to see you, although they don't see your beautiful new hairstyle, but maybe another time. Okay. Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for joining in. So one of the problems with the toxic atmosphere out there, with the culture wars, with the politicization of every issue under the sun, is that quite often we don't get the chance to actually discuss some issues that many people do not have a very good understanding, and there is no space to ask the questions that one might have regarding these issues. And the issues around gender are in the center of that category. So there is this orthodoxy that makes the case that most of the questions have been answered, so there's nothing to discuss anymore. All you have to do is go with what the orthodoxy of the day is. But I think this is not of help to anyone, and particularly with very, very difficult issues that some of us do not have the context to perceive. We need to have these discussions. And today we have with us David Birnbaum. David is a YouTuber. David is also someone who is creating some interesting projects, a film on an issue that is one of these issues that I mentioned as some issues that we need to discuss more and we need to understand more. So, David, some weeks ago, I think, you mentioned that you have been living with gender dysphoria and that you've explained in a video your, let's say, journey, shall I say, your experience with what we'd understand as transgenderism. So two points are my aim today. First, for you to tell us this journey, for us to ask questions, to understand issues more, but also, since you're someone who is a fellow traveler, let's say, in the wider objective sphere, to give us your insight on how do we understand these issues, how do we discuss these issues, and what are we missing maybe in the way that these issues are constructed and discussed in the public sphere out there. So thank you very much for being with us. We're going to mention your documentary. We're going to mention your series. As I said, you run BTI Media. We're going to, Razi can put the link in the chat. So why don't you tell us how this journey of you started, and why did you decide to make this video and start creating this film about this journey and let the world know about your experience?
Okay, yeah, thanks, and thanks for having me here. That's a lot to cover, both everything that I think is wrong along the journey and what my journey has been. But I can jump into the journey briefly, and then when you have questions, feel free to jump in or after. It's been basically 3 years since I even was exposed to the concept, the idea that maybe I'm not the gender I am, right? In some aspect. That's the first time I was exposed to that, even as an idea. I'd never really thought about anything like that, right? I've also been diagnosed with autism. So the reason that's relevant is I didn't think about a lot of stuff that some people do. I never thought about my relationship with myself, my relationship with sex. So the first time it really came about was the first series I ever filmed for BTI Media was called The Safe Space. And I still run that series now. And I had someone who identified as non-binary to talk to me about their experience. For some reason I didn't understand, I was obsessed with the gender issue as soon as I heard about it. But I didn't know why. I just wanted to learn more.
So let's say, David, up to this point, so you see yourself, I am in tune, let's say, with my sex, with my biological gender, with my biological sex. I'm a heterosexual male. And then what is the process? Because someone says, look, I like men, for example, we can perceive it. We can understand. It's like the sexual attraction, let's say, that I feel for a woman, you feel for a man or whatever. But what does it mean to feel that you do not that you do not experience yourself as being the gender you assigned at birth, as the terminology today has it.
Yeah. And so what I think is interesting is until this point, so I was maybe 24 or 25, I hadn't ever associated it that way. I'd never thought of myself as a man, sort of like thinking about myself. I'd always just like saw myself and, oh, I am a man because I have male genitalia and like I look like a man, but I'd never had any internal relationship with myself of feeling manly or anything like that, because I didn't have an internal relationship at all, really. And so what happened is I heard this idea and right away it hit me like, oh, I'm definitely not a typical man. Like, and it's at the time I couldn't explain why. I wrote something and published it. I think it's still on Medium, that basically starts, I feel like I'm non-binary. I don't know what that means, but I feel it. So there was this emotional connection to what I had been explained about the experience, but I had no idea what that meant. And I was a mental health mess trying to figure this out. And again, trying to find guidance and not finding any that made any sense to me. But right away, it was like there was a strong association. And I can get into a little bit of the psychology as to why I think, but I'm not a psychologist, I'm not certain. But like this is where I can sort of explain why that was. But right away, and within 6 months, again, I wasn't certain what it meant, but I started to identify personally with the label lesbian. For some reason, that's what I started to conceptualize myself as. Yeah.
So this would mean, sorry to interrupt you. So first of all, what you mentioned, yeah, we are not, you are not psychologists, and we are not giving here like any official line of objective or psychology on the topic. We're just having a discussion. So what you said that you found something to the term lesbian, would this mean that still, because many people, including myself, till we had the chat behind the scenes some days ago, it's very difficult for them to distinguish these things. So you can feel as a woman when it comes to yourself, but let's say your sexual preference towards women can be intact. Am I getting this right?
It's a little more confusing than that in my experience right now. It's not so cut and dry, because obviously there is like overlap between, you know, how you view yourself sexually and what you're sexually attracted to, right? Obviously that overlaps. But yeah, in terms of like me now and why I, you know, say that I have gender dysphoria, why I say I'm transgender, and why I say I'm a lesbian, or, you know, I wouldn't walk around saying that, but like how I sort of have that association, it is the nature of how I want to be viewed and how I feel good viewing myself, right? So when I compare myself to all of the men I know and all of the women I know, I want to be viewed more like the women. I don't want to be viewed as masculine, as manly. That's not like, that doesn't make me feel good. That doesn't make me feel attractive, right? Like that connection isn't there in my mind in terms of how I'll feel good, right? So I could, you know, dress up in a suit. Like I used to think I was like an 8 out of 10 when I was wearing a suit. I could do that, but it doesn't actually give me emotional value anymore. And I'd be hard pressed to claim it ever really did then. It was just how I was supposed to be, right? But even that, there's the part that's even deeper, and I don't know if we want to go into it, but it is like it's part of my connection with my own body and my bodily desires and urges. And that's where it becomes confusing, is I'm still attracted to women, but I have urges that are more like a typical woman's urges. And I don't know many, like, you know, people who are born a woman and a lesbian and how they view sex and things like this. So I'm still in sort of the development of that aspect. That's a very complex thing. But that's also related to how I view myself, right?
And what you said is very important. And it's only, again, it clicked to me some days ago. I was having a discussion with a person about how you can see your own self from a sensual lens. And it's now that you mentioned what I feel good in myself. Again, someone could say, oh, this is very subjectivistic. This is very like your feelings overwhelmed. No, there is something to it that in order to be sensual or sexual vis-a-vis someone else, first you need to understand yourself as a sensual and sexual being. And again, this, I've been around for 37 years. It just clicked to me the other day based on another discussion I was having. So this helps me understand what you say.
Well,
okay.
If I can jump in. So I actually did a podcast I have a podcast, Let's Talk About Sex. And I spoke with another young person interested in objectivism about sex, about porn, masturbation, and self-esteem. And I think many men don't have as much of this internal sensual relationship and awareness. That's not how I think I was like taught as a man to view sex at all, right? And I think that is actually related to why, when I finally did do it, for me, it was such a drastic change that I couldn't even reconcile the two.
Right. That's a very, very interesting insight. Okay. So take us through then the latest, let's say, parts of this process. So what would be the situation and what would be the steps towards which you would bridge, let's say, this the thing that you wanted to, that you'd see yourself as and you'd feel comfortable in your body with the current situation? So does this also include, let's say, a biological, let's say, a switch? Does it include, would it have to include also actual changes in your body? And what is the process?
Like, from now moving forward?
Yes.
So that's really difficult, like as in it's like emotionally difficult for me to figure out, right? But I have a few very clear lines that I'm not willing to cross, right? So
not just now though, also tell us like so you talked about how this manifested, let's say, in the way you feel, but how does this manifest towards your view of the outside world and towards, for example, how people dress, how you present yourself to the world?
Yes. Okay. So basically, it's only been since December, so 3 months, since I've come to understand and accept that this is true about me, right? And so some of this is still quite new in my processing. But as soon as I accepted it, as soon as I sort of came to, let's say not accepted it, as soon as I came to understand it, my relationship with my clothing changed.
Right.
Like I don't like most of my clothing. It doesn't make me feel comfortable. But again, I'd never felt comfortable. I'd never even thought about it. I just bought clothes that people told me to buy, right? And so so like right now I'm wearing a skirt. It makes me feel much more comfortable for some reason that I don't yet know, right? But we can talk, that's a separate conversation about like, why do women as a whole like skirts sometimes, right? That's like a separate discussion. But so the thing is, for me, I've experimented with clothing primarily. The moment I go out into the world, that's scary, right? So the first thing I did was I painted my nails, and I was terrified to paint my nails because I'm totally torn right now, right? My habitual training is the same as most people's in the culture. I think it's weird, right? When I look at myself dressed as a woman, I feel great. When I look down, I enjoy it. But when I look in the mirror, I really, really don't like it. And that's tough, right? That is so painful to experience that I have to learn how to deal and reconcile these things. Right. But in terms of how it manifested in the world, so first I painted my nails, and then I was like super anxious to go out of my apartment with painted nails. Then I wasn't comfortable in any of my clothes and I was on vacation. So I went and bought some women's clothing, but it was so terrifying to me. And I'm not someone who easily cares about what other people think. But I was so terrified that I had after I bought the clothes, I had maybe like a 2 or 3 hour panic attack, basically, of everything to do with gender. Because it was like the first step of acceptance, right? Painting your nails, okay, they were black, it could be punk, whatever. Buying women's clothing was another step, right? And since then, I've been comfortable with that step, and I've bought some women's clothing. I don't wear it in public still, because that's too difficult for me to do. But the step I've not been able to take is anything what I call semi-permanent. I've been wanting to pierce my ears. I've been considering shaving my arms and legs, but that's another hurdle. That's like semi-permanent. And I'm not yet at that point of comfort, which is, again, really painful. And I can talk about what came, like how I actually came to decide or confirm, like in my mind, yes, this is the case, because I'm still torn, right? Part of me really wishes it wasn't, right? I know how difficult it will be, right? It's definitely easier if I wasn't this way, both in my internal relationship and dealing with the world, right?
I have a question about that last part, but before we get there, just again to clarify some thoughts that some questions might have. So there is this first level of the appearance and small changes, as you said, but quite often the big discussion is about whether it's what you said, permanent changes. And would this include, for example, changes in hormones or changes in genitalia, operations, and all that stuff? Or is this not necessarily part of the same discussion?
No, it is part of the same discussion, right? So that's where I went originally, but then I wanted to bridge the gap, because basically for me, I have certain lines that I know I won't cross. And I'd have to accept that even if I wanted to emotionally. So I will not get bottom surgery. I will not do hormones, because I'm not confident in the state of the science that I will get an actual outcome that I am certain is overall beneficial to my life as a whole, right? Bottom surgery, because the context of the technology of the era I'm in, like that's important for me to hold as well. I have to understand, if I was born 100 years ago, I'd have none of these opportunities, and yet I would still find a way to live a happy life. And I think that's a really important piece of context for me to hold when I think about all of the alleged opportunities I have now, right? So I could be convinced to take hormones, but I think the body is an extremely complex chemical system, and I have seen nothing that would convince me that that's like an overall safe thing. The most tested regular hormone use is, like, from my understanding, related to steroids and sports and stuff. And there's all sorts of issues with that, as I understand it. So hormones to me don't seem like a good decision, no matter what I would want. Bottom surgery, from what I understand, it's not that I get the genitalia I would want. I get some approximation of it, and better to try and learn to accept the genitalia I have, and however long that takes, right? So those are sort of the two most extremes, right? For me, like top surgery is something I would consider, because it's pretty low risk. Lots of women get all sorts of breast implants and stuff. But then that becomes the more complex issue of, how does that impact my life as a whole? If I want to be a successful business person, if I want to be an advocate, and I don't know if that choice would be better or not for my life. I can't decide that yet. And I'm trying as hard as possible to not need to figure it out until it's the appropriate time. And so that's sort of the intersection. The other thing, so the other main thing for me is my hair. Right? Like, I've never liked being bald, but it definitely sucks more now that I associate as being feminine. Right? And like, I know that I used to be a confident, comfortable 7 or 8 out of 10 as a male. Now I know I'm like a 3 or 4. Right? And so, like, that's my view of it. And baldness is obviously a part of that. And, you know, what will I do about that? What will I do about facial hair and these sorts of things? But that's sort of, so that's where the line is, right? Between shaving and, you know, maybe laser, like all of these well-tested technologies that, you know, maybe men use more sometimes, maybe women use more sometimes, but how do I take that to optimize my life, my appearance, how I feel in my body?
Good. And thank you, because again, this was a big introduction before we went to the, let's say, bigger issues. But I don't think there's anything bigger than actually understanding this journey, because if we don't understand it, we cannot move to, let's say, the most abstract topics. So now I want to ask you something about the more, let's say, abstract topics. So I've heard two very powerful ideas about the issue of transgenderism. The one says, and they reach the same result, interestingly. The one says, it proves that that all this discussion about biological reality and biologically determined gender is not the case, because what you actually feel inside you makes you overcome all these things. So it's this voluntary leap. And someone would say there's even something very selfish in a good way in it. The other side says, no, actually, you know what? This proves the power of the biological reality of gender, because as you said, this is something which is not easy. This is something that requires a struggle. So, and yet this power within you that says, no, I'm not what I thought I am, I'm something else. This is it's a strong power, biological power from within. So actually this proves that there is something, let's say, biological in gender. Do you think this discussion is fruitful, and where do you see yourself in this discussion?
So that's really interesting. I'd never heard the second aspect phrased the way you did, about how it actually shows the strength of biological gender because of how difficult this is for me to deal with. So that's interesting. I honestly have to think about that more. I'd definitely reject the prior though, right? Like, I don't think that this, because I also think it's important to sort of disconnect two different discussions that are layered on top of each other in the way in the way gender is talked about normally. Because one of them is, okay, the gender norms, how, quote, should women dress, how, quote, should men dress in any era, in any culture, that's shifting all of the time, right? How a man was supposed to dress now to be cool is different than 100 years ago, right? And they often sort of intersect that too closely with the actual ideas of gender dysphoria, transgenderism, and things like that. And it's important to keep them distinct, right? And so if they primarily think it's about this sort of how you want to look, right, and how you choose to present yourself, then that is, I don't know if subjective is the right word, but it's more variable, it's changing. And so they're trying to use that as an excuse to say that there's no biological reality at all, right? So if you abstract from male versus female, they could say, oh, 200 years ago, men wore wigs and kilts, and now they don't, so there's no gender, right? Like, or there's no sex. Like, that doesn't make any sense, but that's basically what they're putting forward. And so I totally reject that, right? But it's like that conversation, the idea of gender norms and how they can be damaging to some people, maybe many people, if people aren't independent and are just funneled through their expectations. That conversation got a lot of fervor because of the transgender experience, right? That's the lens that really blew it up as an issue, because it's really an issue for someone like me, right? And so, but they've sort of then, I don't know the right expression, but they've turned that around, and now they're marching forward with gender expression, so to speak, as the leading issue, which I don't think it is. And so yeah, so in your 8 minute, in the video that you provide the sum up, let's say, of the journey, you mentioned that you don't necessarily share the prism on the topic that is dominant nowadays in the public sphere. And you mentioned also the issue of objectivity and reality somewhere there. Do you want to explain with simple terms what's your beef with the dominant narrative, let's say, regarding transgenderism? And how would you differ yourself in the way you experience the issue, but also in the way you view it as an intellectual, let's say, trying to see it from a more detached point of view, if that is possible? Yeah, so I mean, I'm not a philosopher, but I think it fundamentally does come down to primacy of consciousness versus primacy of existence, right? Do you think that if the mind and body are in disagreement, which is the claim, right? My mind thinks I'm a woman and my body has male genitalia. Which is correct fundamentally? Because you'll hear people tell me I was born in the wrong body, right? My mind wishes I was a woman, so I was born in the wrong body. I don't think my consciousness couldn't exist separate from my body. I am me. I am all, like, there's not two things, right? And so right away they give priority to, oh, well, if you feel like a woman, and even not just emotional, but like deep, let's say, like deeply feel like a woman, that means you are one, right? so they're giving total primacy to the conscious experience of the individual. Whereas I say, no, I am a man because I was born with male genitalia. That is what it means. And for some reason that I don't know, I really, really feel and wish I were a woman, right? But that is a totally different context. Am I a woman, or do I wish as much as possible that I were one, right? And for me, I couldn't kid myself into thinking I was one, no matter what I did. I can't dismiss the context of what I know about science and biology and these sorts of things, right? So even if I fully transitioned as much as possible, that context isn't erased. I don't have ovaries, I can't give birth, right? Like these sorts of things that I associate with the concept of woman, right? And so because of that difference, it really manifests in almost every aspect of the way the mainstream talks about gender issues. So we can get into any specifics, but I also think the guidance, right? When I was first trying to deal with this, none of it made sense. So it was just like loops running in my mind. I couldn't actually ground it to anything that made sense because I was logical. I wanted to be rational. I wanted to be scientific. And so I felt an association with this experience, but I couldn't do anything with it. So it was just chaotic. And it was like a really bad feedback loop in my mind, right? But I'm happy to go into any specifics of the cultural, because I spent basically 6 hours covering like all of them that I thought there were. But if there's any in particular you'd want to talk about.
Yeah, we're gonna, because we need to move to Clubhouse, we're gonna finish with you talking about this project. But before there, one last question, and it's related to that last point. Why do you think it's so difficult to have these conversations? So why is it that instead of trying to understand what is happening and trying to link it with the rest of our context about reality, consciousness, existence, why are we consumed in this discussion whether trans men are men have period? So these have become slogans that have overtaken, in a way, the discussion, in my opinion, a completely productiveless and fruitless way. Why do you think is it this way? Why do you think that this topic became so loaded? Is it only because transgender people have faced all sorts of difficulties or ridicule or discrimination in the past? Or do you think there's something else that makes this topic so fruitful for the new culture wars?
So I think there's a few different answers to that question, which is why, and they've coalesced into transgenderism, I think, being one of the biggest sort of no-go issues, right? So one is that there was already this victim narrative generally, right? The more difficult your experience, the more we can't talk about it. And I'm not quite sure why transgenderism got to the top of the most difficult. I mean, it's definitely by far the most difficult thing I've ever had to deal with. I don't know how it relates to being Black in America or whatever, right? But within the Oppression Olympics narrative, for some reason, trans got to the top, right? So that's one reason. That narrative was already there. It was already taking ground, right? Homosexuality, people of color, feminism, or whatever it was, right? And for some reason, this won out. Potentially, one of the reasons that was the case is also why it's been such a political powerhouse of a movement. And because it's totally up to your own assessment of yourself, right? So if you're a Black conservative, no one can say you're not Black. If you're a gay conservative, it would be difficult for people to say you're not gay because, it's, again, more obvious, more evident in the experience and in the manifestation. But if I'm a, quote, trans conservative, or if I'm a trans person who disagrees with the narrative, they're the only ones talking about what it even means to be trans. So if there's no counter argument of what it even means, they'll say, no, you're not trans. You don't agree with our definition of what trans is. Therefore, you're not even part of the movement at all. So it's a total ability to exclude everyone, whereas that can't happen with homosexuals, with the Black community. So it's so powerful. And I think that's also why more subjective. Anyone can sort of claim it based on their terms of what it is, right? So that's really been powerful. So I think those are the 2.5 reasons why this is like such a touchy issue. And that's layered on top of, I think that anyone who's 35 or under is basically a whiny little wimp online, right? There's such a hypersensitivity to everything. And, I have theories as to why it's become so loud and important in the culture for some reason, but that's just layered on top. Everyone whines about everything all of the time now. So when you layer that into the Impression Olympics, someone trying to get a political edge, it's a recipe for what we have now.
And you know what's the saddest thing in this climate? That I bet that some of the people who would cancel someone for being a TERF or whatever, I bet that they don't know half of the stuff that you explained today. That right. This is just one other issue to kind of flex in the culture wars. Anyway, we're going to move into club. Yeah, sure. Go on.
Last thing, so I posted on TikTok a few times about this issue, and I'm already being totally invalidated because I'm somehow excluding other people's experiences. My experience is invalid. And it's like, it's quite absurd, but it's touches on what you were talking about.
So before parting words and before we say something about something new that the ARC UK is doing, do you want to tell us a bit about the project that is currently underway, the effort you're doing with, if I understood, this is the documentary or a film, actually not a short. You said you have a lot of hours gathered together of material. So why don't you tell us a bit more about this and where people can find you and how people can help with this?
Yeah, so thanks. So if people go to btimedia.me, that's my company's website, and there's a support page there if they want to support any of the projects I'm working on, and in particular this one. I spent 2 full days filming with very high quality production value, about $15,000-$20,000 of value, basically 12 to 14 hours of content covering every aspect of this that I think I could cover in that amount of time. So there's both sort of a very deep exploration of my journey from when I first got exposed to the idea I might be trans, all the way to coming to accept it and the pain that's been associated with that. And in particular, there's an hour and a half of just since December, how difficult it has been to actually work to accept this of myself. And then there's also a series of videos that basically there's maybe 5 or 6 that are talking about key concepts, key sort of contextualization that I think needs to be done on this issue that I don't see anywhere else. And also then a lot of the sort of more cultural, political topics like, bathrooms, sports, this kind of stuff, giving my perspective. And I'm really trying to put a new cornerstone into the gender discussion. So that's sort of what I've been working on. And yeah, if anyone is interested in supporting that, I'm funding this all myself, and I still need money to get it through post-production. So if anyone can support, I'd appreciate that.
So BTI Media is the place to go if someone wants to support. And as you said, we didn't even touch issues such as the sports stuff, but that's why we have Clubhouse, where we're going to move the discussion in 1 minute. Before that, just maybe let me say very quickly, this Sunday, we begin the new project of ARC UK, open only to members, which is the Productivity Hub, which is where we discuss related to productivity, books, methods, skills, and particular entrepreneurs. So first, we do it probably once every month. We start with the book Extreme Ownership. So our members had some time to read the book. I've created a companion of 44 pages where it sums up the chapter, the main takeaways, the main ideas, and the main ideas seen from an objectivist point of view. And we have our first meeting on Sunday. If you want to take a flavor of this, the promo video is up on ARC UK social media. So I encourage people to have a look. I think only for this project, it would be worth being members of ARC UK to add to all these other things. So David, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much for this discussion. I've learned stuff. I wish all the discussion on this topic would be that informative and productive. So let's move it to Clubhouse. See you all there and have a good weekend.